Loud, frantic bangs echoed through the house, shaking the wooden door. Serwa, open this door right now. Who is in there with you? Her father's booming voice filled the night, laced with anger and panic. Serwa stood frozen in her dimly lit room, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Her hands trembled as she turned to look at Ekene, who lay motionless on her bed. Ekene, wake up. With all this noise, you're still asleep? She whispered harshly, shaking him. Ekene's eyes flew open, wide with fear. He scrambled up, his body drenched in sweat, mirroring the terror in Serwa's eyes. What do we do now? Ekene stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the sound of her parents' furious banging growing louder. You need to run, Serwa urged, her voice frantic. Go, through the window, now! Where do I go? It's midnight! Ekene's voice cracked, his legs refusing to move as reality crashed down on him. Oh, God! He fell to his knees, the weight of his mistakes pressing heavily on his shoulders. If this is the last night I live, please, forgive me. Forgive me for all my sins, he prayed, his words barely audible over the furious pounding outside. The door shook violently. Serwa, open this door now, or I'll break it down, her father shouted, his voice trembling with rage. Tears streamed down Serwa's face. She grabbed Ekene by the arm, desperately pulling him toward the window. Go, Ekene, please, before it's too late. The fear, the urgency, the pounding, everything blurred into one heart-stopping moment as Ekene took one last look at Serwa. I'm so sorry, he whispered, before slipping out into the darkness, leaving Serwa alone to face the fury that awaited her. Serwa stared at her small but growing belly, her mind swirling with a mix of confusion and regret. She thought back to that night, the night that changed her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. How had it all happened so quickly? How had she ended up pregnant by a man she knew nothing about? In the small, bustling town of Oyibi, where dreams thrived and everyone knew each other's business, Serwa was known as the girl with a heart of gold. She was always helping others, putting their needs above her own. Her kindness knew no bounds, even if it sometimes led her into trouble. One fateful evening, as she walked home after helping an elderly neighbor, she encountered a young man who looked lost and exhausted. He was tall, with deep brown eyes and a rugged look that hinted at the struggles of the day. Please, I'm new here, he called out, desperation thick in his voice. I came for a job interview, but I missed my bus. I have no family here, and my town is far away. Please, can you help me, just for tonight? Serwa hesitated, but the kindness in her heart wouldn't let her turn away. She knew it wasn't safe to bring a stranger into her home, but she couldn't bear to leave him out in the cold. Okay, she said, you can stay, just for tonight. That night, as they sat together in her small living room, they talked about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Ekene was charming, and his stories made Serwa laugh in a way she hadn't in a long time. They connected, and one thing led to another. Before she knew it, they found themselves in each other's arms, sharing an intimate moment that would change everything. Just as they lay together in the afterglow, they heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up. Panic set in. Her parents, who had traveled out of town, had returned earlier than expected. Serwa's heart sank as she heard their footsteps approaching. Serwa, open this door. Who's in there with you? Her father's voice boomed, each word more furious than the last. Ekene jumped up, fear and guilt written all over his face. What do we do? He whispered, his voice shaking. Run, Serwa urged, pushing him toward the window. Run before they catch you. Ekene slipped out just as her father broke down the door. Serwa stood there, her heart racing, tears streaming down her face, and a secret growing inside her that she didn't even realize yet. Serwa's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the soft cry of her lovely daughter, Oye. She looked down at her child, who gazed back up at her with eyes that reminded her so much of Ekene's. Where could he be now, she often wondered, the memories of that night flashing through her mind. Despite all the uncertainties, Oye was the light of Serwa's life, a living reminder of her brief encounter with a man who had vanished as quickly as he had appeared. Sadly, a few months after Oye's birth, Serwa fell ill. Her condition worsened rapidly, and before anyone could understand what was happening, she passed away, leaving her daughter an orphan. With no one else to turn to, Oye's grandmother took her in. She was an elderly woman with deep lines etched into her face, her eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 stories. Despite her frail hands, she cared for Oye with all the love she could muster, determined to give her granddaughter a better life than Serwa had. Oye grew up in their small, modest home, surrounded by the warmth and wisdom of her grandmother. The old woman taught her everything she knew: how to cook, how to sew, and how to face the world with strength and dignity. "You are stronger than you think, my child," she would often say, brushing back Oye's hair. "Your mother was strong, and so are you." Despite their struggles, Oye's grandmother never let her feel like she was lacking. She would work tirelessly, weaving baskets, selling vegetables, and doing whatever she could to provide for Oye. As they sat together in the evenings, she would share stories of Serwa, always ending with, "Your mother loved you more than anything, Oye. Remember that." When Oye turned 18, her grandmother fell ill. Despite all her efforts to care for the woman who had been her rock, Oye could only watch helplessly as the light in her grandmother's eyes began to fade. On her deathbed, the grandmother pressed a small, worn necklace into Oye's hand. "This belonged to your mother," she whispered, her voice weak, "and now it belongs to you. There is a story you need to uncover, my child. Don't be afraid to seek it." The necklace was engraved with the letter E, and next to it was a small picture of Serwa, her face radiant with happiness. "Who are you, Mama?" Oye whispered, tears streaming down her face. The grandmother's passing left Oye alone in the world, but her words stayed with her, urging her to find the answers she needed. With nothing but the clothes on her back, the necklace, and the photograph, Oye decided to leave the village and travel to the city, determined to find out who her mother had been. She searched tirelessly for work, and eventually she found a job as a maid in the home of a wealthy businessman, Mr. Ekene. Mr. Ekene was a man of immense power and influence. He was admired by many in society, a man who had risen from nothing to become one of the wealthiest men in the city. People often spoke about his charitable deeds, his business acumen, and his elegant family. Yet, behind the high gates of his mansion, things were far from perfect. When Oye first arrived at Mr. Eken's home, she was overwhelmed by its grandeur. The mansion was like a palace: polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and rooms that stretched endlessly. But for all its beauty, the house felt cold, almost as if warmth and kindness had no place within its walls. From the very beginning, Mrs. Ifunanya made it clear that Oye was nothing more than the help. "You'll address me as Madam, do you understand?" she snapped on Oye's first day. "And if I ever find you slacking, you'll be out on the streets faster than you can blink." Oye swallowed her fear and nodded. She worked tirelessly, cleaning and cooking, doing everything she could to prove her worth. but no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. You call this clean? Ifunanya would bark, pointing out imaginary dust. You're as useless as you look. Do it again. Ada and Ngozi, Mr. Ekene's daughters, were no better. They took every opportunity to remind Oye of her place. You're nothing but a servant, Ada would sneer. You don't belong here. What makes you think you deserve to walk the same halls as us? Ngozi would taunt. Don't you dare forget, you're just the daughter of some nobody. They delighted in making Oye's life miserable, spilling food on purpose so she would have to clean it up, or demanding that she carry their bags even when they weren't heavy. Every day, Oye endured their cruelty, but she never let them see her cry. The only person who treated her with any kindness was Kelechi, the eldest son. He would sometimes sneak into the kitchen late at night, offering her a piece of fruit or sharing stories of his own struggles. You're stronger than they think, he would say softly. Don't let them break you. Despite the constant mistreatment, Oye's resilience shone through. She was intelligent, quick to learn, and never complained, no matter how tired or hurt she was. Mr. Ekene noticed this about her. He saw how she carried herself with grace despite the way his wife and daughters treated her, and it stirred something inside him. She reminded him of someone he had loved deeply, a memory he had long buried. One morning, he made a decision that would change everything. Oye, he said, his voice calm yet authoritative, I'm enrolling you in the same school as my children. You deserve an education. Ifunanya was livid. You can't be serious, she yelled. She's just a maid. What will people think if they see her there? She's not just a maid, Mr. Ekene replied, his eyes narrowing. She has potential, and I intend to help her realize it. The girls, Ada and Ngozi, were horrified at the thought of Oye attending their prestigious school. She doesn't belong there, they whined, but Mr. Ekene stood his ground. And so, Oye found herself stepping into a world that was even more hostile than the mansion. At school, Ada and Ngozi wasted no time turning the other students against her. They spread rumors, whispering that she was nothing more than a charity case, an orphan with no family, no future. They called her names like village girl and bush rat, laughing when she tried to hold back her tears. One afternoon, Oye sat alone during lunch, clutching her small meal of rice and stew when Ada and Ngozi approached with a group of girls. Ada snatched the food from her hands, dumping it on the ground. Oops, looks like you won't be eating today, she said with a smirk. The other girls laughed, but Oye refused to break. She knelt down, quietly picking up her food, brushing off the dirt. Why don't you fight back? Ngozi taunted, shoving her shoulder. Are you that weak? But Oye looked up at them, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I'm not weak, she said softly. I'm just not like you. That day, she went home with a heavy heart, feeling like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She cried in the small room she shared with another maid, wondering why life had to be so hard. But in those moments of pain, she thought of her grandmother's words, You are stronger than you think. Determined not to let them defeat her, Oye threw herself into her studies. Every night, after cleaning the mansion and enduring the harsh words from Mrs. Ifunanya and her daughters, she would stay up late, reading the books Mr. Ekene had bought for her. She refused to be seen as just the help. Over time, Mr. Ekene began to notice Oye's intelligence and curiosity. One evening, as he passed by the library, he saw her bent over a thick textbook, her brow furrowed in concentration. You've been studying hard, he said, surprising her. Yes, sir, she replied, quickly closing the book, unsure of how he would react. Tell me, Oye, he said, What do you want to be when you grow up? She hesitated, unsure whether she should speak her truth. I want to be someone important, she finally whispered, her voice tinged with hope. I want to be someone my mother would be proud of. Mr. Ekene felt a pang in his chest. There was something about this girl, something that felt so familiar, so painfully familiar. You will be, he said softly. You will be. Oye's determination and hard work began to pay off in ways she had never imagined. Despite the bullying, the mockery, and the countless attempts to bring her down, she rose above it all. In school, she worked harder than anyone, spending long nights reading every book she could find, asking questions, and seeking help whenever she was unsure. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. She excelled in her exams, and soon she was recognized as one of the brightest students in her school. It was the day of the school's annual award ceremony when Oye's name echoed through the hall. Best Student of the Year, Oye, the announcer declared. The room erupted in applause, but in one corner, Mrs. Ifunanya and her daughters sat with expressions of disbelief. Their heads hung low, their pride shattered, as they watched the same girl they had tormented stand on the stage, beaming with joy. Mr. Ekene, on the other hand, couldn't hide his pride. He clapped louder than anyone, his face beaming with satisfaction. I knew she had it in her, he whispered to Kelechi, who nodded in agreement, smiling widely. But while Mr. Eken's heart swelled with pride, Mrs. Ifunanya's heart burned with rage. How dare she? Ifunanya muttered to herself as they drove back home. How dare that girl outshine my daughters? From that day, Mrs. Ifunanya made up her mind. Oye had to go. She couldn't bear the idea of this village girl stealing the spotlight from her precious daughters any longer. She began plotting ways to make Oye's life even more unbearable, determined to force her out of their home. But just as she was preparing to strike, something else began to gnaw at her peace of mind. One evening, as Mrs. Ifunanya sat in her bedroom, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and felt a chill run down her spine. It was an unknown number. Hesitating, she answered, and the voice on the other end sent a shiver down her spine. So, you think you can forget about our deal now that you're living comfortably, huh? The voice sneered. Mrs. Ifunanya's heart skipped a beat. What do you want? She stammered, fear creeping into her voice. Oh, now you want to pretend you don't remember? The caller continued, his tone dripping with menace. You promised me you'd keep in touch, but now you're acting like you don't know me. You're playing with fire, Ifunanya. Please, she begged, her voice shaking. I haven't forgotten. I'll send you the money. Just give me more time. But the caller wasn't having it. You better keep your end of the bargain, he growled, or I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. The call ended, leaving Mrs. Ifunanya trembling, her hands slick with sweat. She sat there, her mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. The thought of her past catching up with her made her sick with fear. She had spent years building this perfect life, this image of the devoted wife and mother, but if the truth came out, everything would fall apart. Over the following weeks, the calls became more frequent, each one more threatening than the last. They made her jump at every sound, her nerves frayed and her temper short. Mr. Ekene noticed his wife's strange behavior and tried to reach out. Is everything okay, Ifunanya? He asked one evening. You seem distracted lately. I'm fine, she snapped, a little too quickly. I'm just tired. But Mr. Ekene wasn't convinced. He could tell something was wrong, but every time he tried to press her, she would change the subject or come up with some excuse that didn't quite add up. Meanwhile, Oye continued to flourish, both at school and in the mansion. Her achievements only seemed to make Mrs. Ifunanya and her daughters more resentful, but it was clear that nothing they did could break her spirit. And as Mrs. Ifunanya's paranoia grew, she couldn't help but feel that Oye's success was a constant reminder of her own failures, of the life she had tried so desperately to leave behind. What was this secret that haunted Mrs. Ifunanya? And how long would she be able to keep it hidden before everything came crashing down around her? Mr. Ekene sat in his office, lost in thought, when he suddenly remembered an important document he had forgotten at home. Irritated with himself, he decided to drive back to the house to retrieve it. As he stepped inside, he noticed an eerie silence. "Ifunanya!" he called out, but there was no response. He walked further in, assuming she might be in another part of the house. As he headed toward his study, he paused when he heard Ifunanya's voice echoing from their bedroom. She was speaking loudly, her tone dripping with frustration. "I'm tired of this whole thing. Who is taking your children away from you? You and I know the kids are yours. Not a single month passes without me sending you money. I'm just waiting for the right moment to ask Ekene for a huge sum of money to shut you up for good." Mr. Ekene froze, his heart pounding. "My children belong to another man?" His breath caught in his throat as the realization struck him like a blow. The words repeated in his head, each one piercing deeper than the last. How could she be so cruel? How long had she been lying to him? Shaking, he quietly left the house, making sure Ifunanya didn't see him. He couldn't concentrate on anything after that. The betrayal twisted inside him like a knife. He was barely present in his work, his thoughts consumed with Ifunanya's confession. That night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, he made a decision. He would have a secret DNA test done on all 3 children. Days later, he received the results. As he read through the report, his hands trembled, his vision blurred by tears of rage and sorrow. None of the children were his, not one. With fury blazing in his eyes, he stormed into the house and threw the papers on the dining table in front of Ifunanya. "What is the meaning of this, woman? I need an explanation now," he demanded, his voice echoing through the mansion. Ifunanya glanced at the papers, and as she read the words, "DNA test results," her face drained of color. Her lips quivered, and she couldn't bring herself to meet Mr. Iken's gaze. I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What have you done that needs forgiveness?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Answer me." Sobbing uncontrollably, Ifunanya finally confessed, "The children aren't yours, Ekene. None of them are." The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a death sentence. 3 years into our marriage, I grew desperate. I wanted children so badly. In a moment of weakness, I slept with our gate man, Mick. When I found out I was pregnant, I asked him to leave his job and promised to take care of him in secret. He fathered all 3 of our children. She fell to her knees, begging, "Please forgive me. I was afraid. I didn't know what else to do." Devastated, Mr. Ekene could barely look at her. His heart shattered into a million pieces, and he felt a rage unlike anything he had ever known. Unable to stay in the same room as her, he walked out, saying, "Leave if you must. I can't stop you anymore, but the children can stay if they want. They've been my family all these years, and I won't abandon them now." That night, Kelechi approached him, tears in his eyes. "Father, I know the truth now, but you're the only father I've ever known. You've raised me, cared for me, taught me everything I know. I could never leave you." Ada and Ngozi soon followed, though their reasons were less heartfelt. They couldn't imagine giving up the life of luxury and comfort they had always known. "We want to stay too, Papa," they said, their voices trembling with fear and uncertainty. The days that followed were dark and painful for Mr. Ekene. He became withdrawn, consumed by the betrayal and loneliness that surrounded him. The only light in his life was Oye, the maid who had slowly won his heart with her kindness and resilience. He began to confide in her, sharing the stories of his youth, his regrets, and the woman he had once loved more than life itself. Meanwhile, Ada and Ngozi grew increasingly bitter. They couldn't stand how their father seemed to favor Oye over them, and their jealousy turned into hatred. Determined to get rid of her, they concocted a plan to frame her. One night, they stole a large sum of money from their father's safe and hid it in Oye's bag. The next morning, Mr. Ekene discovered the missing money and called everyone together. "The money is gone, and I need to know who took it," he said sternly. Ada and Ngozi immediately suggested that everyone's bags be searched, confident that their plan would work. He started with Kelechi, but found nothing. When Mr. Ekene opened Oye's bag, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat, the necklace with the engraved E that Serwa had left for her daughter. Overcome with emotion, he quickly dismissed everyone else and called Oye into his study. "Oye," he began, holding up the necklace, "who gave you this?" Oye looked confused but answered honestly, "My grandmother gave it to me, sir. She told me it belonged to my mother." "What was your mother's name?" Mr. Ekene asked, his heart pounding. "She was called Serwa," Oye whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I never knew her. I only have a small picture of her." At the mention of the name, Mr. Ekene felt his knees buckle. "Serwa? My Serwa?" He collapsed into his chair, his heart breaking all over again. Looking at the picture, he said, "She was my love, Oye, the woman I've searched for all my life." As Mr. Ekin stared at the necklace and listened to Oye talk about her late mother, he felt a mixture of emotions, joy, sorrow, and disbelief. But something still didn't feel real. He needed more proof. Then he noticed something that took his breath away. "Oye," he said softly, his voice trembling, "can I see your wrist?" Confused, Oye extended her right hand. Mr. Eken's eyes widened as he saw a small, distinct birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her wrist, just like the one he had on his own. His heart skipped a beat and tears filled his eyes. "I have the same mark," he whispered, showing her his wrist. "Your mother that night told me that if I ever had a child, they might inherit this birthmark from me." Oye gasped, her eyes widening as she stared at the matching marks. It was undeniable. This was the proof she needed, the confirmation that she belonged. "So, it's true," she murmured, tears welling up. "You're really my father." "Yes, my daughter," Mr. Eken said, pulling her into a gentle embrace, tears streaming down his face. "I am, and I promise I'll never let you go again." The revelation left them both in tears, each one grieving the years they had lost, yet overjoyed at the bond they had found. At this point, Mr. Eken said softly, "Oi, my daughter, please be honest with me. Did you take this money?" Oye's eyes widened in shock, and her hands began to tremble. "No, sir, I didn't take it," she replied, her voice steady but laced with pain. "I have never stolen anything in my life. I was raised to value honesty, even when it's hard. I would never take something that doesn't belong to me." After composing himself, Mr. Ekene called Ada and Ngozi into the study. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, his voice like steel. "Did you steal that money?" Realizing they had no escape, Ada and Ngozi broke down and confessed. "We did it, Papa. We wanted her gone. We thought if you found the money in her bag, you would throw her out." Mr. Eken's eyes burned with anger and disappointment. "Oye is my real daughter, and from this day forward, she is no longer your maid. If you wish to stay in this house, you will respect her. Otherwise, leave." With their heads bowed, Ada and Ngozi nodded, too shocked to speak. For the first time, they saw Oye not as a servant, but as a sister, someone who had endured more pain and suffering than they could ever imagine. Oye, now the true mistress of the house, proved to be wise and compassionate. Mr. Ekene, proud and filled with a new sense of purpose, handed over the management of his businesses to her, trusting that she would carry on his legacy. The truth always comes to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. Lies and deceit may offer temporary relief, but they always lead to destruction. Kindness and resilience can conquer even the deepest wounds. Oye's strength and compassion transformed her from a servant to a leader. True family is not defined by blood, but by love, respect, and the willingness to stand by one another, even in the darkest times. Greed and jealousy will always lead to downfall, but humility and sincerity pave the way to greatness.